of webinars that sprung from the National Adaptation Forum, the next of which will be held in May 2015 in St. Louis, Missouri. Today's webinar is called Ensuring Social Equity in Preparing for Climate Change Challenges and Solutions. This webinar will discuss how climate change is impacting communities of color disproportionately and look at how the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, Environmental Justice and Climate Justice Program, is working to educate communities to adapt to climate change. We'll hear about equity indicators and applications and about how these innovative indicators are being applied to the planning of newly formed eco-districts in Longview, Texas and Gulfport, Mississippi. I'm Laura Hansen. I'm the Chief Scientist and Executive Director of EcoAdapt, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. National Adaptation Forum webinars are held quarterly so we can continue discussing how to move adaptation forward as a community. If you'd like to recommend a topic or interested in partnering and co-hosting a webinar, please email me at laura@ecoadapt.org. Before we get started, I'd like to go through some housekeeping rules to ensure a successful webinar. Please make sure that you place telephones, cell phones, or computers on mute, especially if we're going to unmute you later for questions. This will help reduce feedback. If you're using voice over IP, please make sure that even your computer is on mute. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Throughout the webinar, please use the question function or the chat function to submit questions to the presenters, and we'll do our best to get them all answered. Sometimes if they don't all get answered during the webinar, we send them out to presenters and they answer them afterwards. You can also use the chat function to report any technical issues or problems you're having during the webinar, and we'll do our best to try and help you. The chat function can also be used to communicate between attendees. So if there's something that you want to share, a link to something interesting or something you want to make sure people aren't missing, we encourage you to talk to fellow attendees by using the all audience option for sending a communication through chat. Finally, I want to let everyone know that we're recording and posting the webinar on both the EcoAdapt website and on the CAKE site for future listening pleasure. They should be available by next week and can be viewed at ecoadapt.org/webinars and at cakex.org. Presentations will be available online as PDFs on the EcoAdapt website where you found the link to this webinar. So today, next slide, please, Whitney. Today, we are joined by four fantastic speakers who are going to share some really innovative work with us. The first is Jacqui Patterson. She's the director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program, in which all of this work lies. Since 2007, Jacqui has served as the coordinator and co-founder of Women of Color United. She holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Maryland and a master's degree in public health from Johns Hopkins University. She currently serves as the International Committee of the U.S. Social Forum and in the Advisory Committee of the Grandmothers Project and the Gulf Guardian Fellowship Program and the Steering Committee on Interfaith Moral Action on Climate Change and the Green Group Board Member of Color, as well as on the Board of Directors of the Institute of the Black World, the Center for Story-Based Strategy, and the U.S. Climate Action Network. So she's exceptionally busy, but we're exceptionally lucky to have her with us today. Vic Verma is the chair of Signs Initiative, Safe Inviting Green Neighborhoods. The Signs Initiative is a joint partnership of the NAACP Longview Unit number 6197, working effectively for Clean Air Now, We Can, and Organizing for Action East Texas. He also serves as the regional lead for Organizing for America, East Texas, and is a member of the executive committee of the NAACP Longview Unit. Vic is employed as an engineer with blast control systems in Gulfport, Texas. He received his master's degree in civil engineering at Texas A&M and his master's in business administration at the University of Texas at Tyler. We also have Branden Johnson, who's the president of the NAACP Longview, Texas chapter, and is both professionally and personally committed to service and community organizing. Finally, but not lastly, we have Kathy Egland, who's the chair of the Environment and Climate Justice Committee for the National Board of Directors of the NAACP. She's the founder of Special Programs for Advancing Children's Education, SPACE Learning Academy, an early childhood education excellence summer program. Egland has a lifetime of advocacy involvement in civil and human rights, serving on various task forces and committees and attending many conferences and summits. She's a survivor of Hurricane Katrina and was instrumental in the Gulf restoration efforts after Katrina, as well as BP Deepwater Horizon Gulf oil spill in 2010. And she'll be talking to us about the work that's going on in Mississippi. Thank you all very much for being here, and I hope all of you listening enjoy the webinar. Jacqui, I turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining this the webinar and wanting to hear about this work. So I'm really honored to be joined by two of the branches that are doing the most forward work in this area of strengthening community resilience through eco-district planning. So excited to quickly get to hearing about the work that is actually happening on the ground. Excuse me, but born out of that, and I also thank EcoAdapt for hosting us and being interested in being a platform for us sharing about the work that we're doing and what we're hearing, learning, how we're being challenged, and how we're overcoming some of those challenges. So, so it'll be a pleasure to speak with you all. So I'm really going to go through and talk about some of the experiences that we've had in working with communities who are seeking to build their resilience, who are impacted by whether it's disasters, shifts in agricultural yields, sea level rise, or are preparing for these impacts. And so we'll talk a little bit about the context in which they find themselves, and then also about the ways that they're measuring success in building resilience at the community level. And so this indicators document was kind of born out of being a part of a number of conversations, even at the national, regional, and state level, where folks have made good efforts towards asking these questions about what it means to build resilience, but often falls short of actually thinking about the social implications of these climate change, and how we can really make sure that we are reaching the most marginalized and most vulnerable communities, and really building resilience at the community and individual level, and how to actually measure that. So as an example, some of the processes I've been a part of might have an endpoint of having a stormwater management system in place as an endpoint, as opposed to having as an endpoint like how many people are not being flooded out of their homes in the next flooding incident. So just as an example, so we really want to look at real people impacts on these of climate change effects, and how to really measure that. So without further ado, I'll talk a little bit about. So next slide. I'll start to take us through the framework. Am I doing the slides? Sorry.
Yes, you should have control.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't know if I was doing it. So, okay, good. So I'll just do that myself. Sorry. So first we'll talk a little bit about kind of the framework that we've come to, and it was actually based on some work out of Rutgers that seemed to most match the type of framework that we thought was important in terms of really measuring equity in resilience building. And so this framework talks about equity and kind of the governance, decision making, who's at the table to give input on decisions and planning, design, planning, and evaluation, and who's making decisions about what the policies, programs, protocols, practices are as we build resilience and we do community planning, adaptation planning. And then whether there's equity in distribution of resources, what formulas are being used for allocation of resources, etc. And then going back to the governance, who's making the decisions about what those formulas would be in terms of allocations of resources. And then equity and outcomes. So as you see the questions, who is most impacted, who's currently most resilient, and how do we even those scales, who's affected by the collateral damage of even some of the measures that we use, and we'll talk more about this, some of the measures that we use to build resilience or to build sustainability or to implement adaptation measures. Sometimes some of those very measures can actually have unintended consequences, like gentrification that happens after climate adaptation planning that happens in certain communities. And so how do we look at that in an outward way instead of seeing that that's happened after it's already happened, and how do we plan for it accordingly? who survives various events, who thrives. A lot of times, particularly in distressed communities, it's really the goal is survival, and we really want to move that goalpost to really looking at thriving communities instead of just communities who are hanging on by a thread of just kind of perpetuation of life at best. So then the next slide is really back again. The next slide is also kind of couching this within a human and civil rights framework, because that of course is the core framework of what we do as the NAACP and other social justice organizations. So I mean, we hopefully in the U.S. we're not as familiar with human rights as we are in an international context. So I always want to post the human rights to remind us of that global framework, right to self-determination, safe and healthy work conditions, the highest standard of physical and mental health. Again, not just surviving, but a higher standard. Right to food, right to decent living condition, and really also in the procedural defining what decency is in terms of a living condition, not just a roof over your head, but certain measures of decency, equal rights between men and women, rights of youth and children to be free from exploitation. So these are kind of internationally signed on human rights. And then civil rights, making sure that we have really equal rights under the law and protection from discrimination in these various ways described below. So I'll just kind of take us quickly through some of the ways that we're seeing communities impacted by climate change, and within that we'll talk about some of the pre-existing vulnerabilities and how communities are differentially impacted as a result. So first we talk about, sorry, I'm a little too trigger happy with this slide, shifting. So shifts in agricultural yields. So this is a picture of literally kind of scorched earth that used to be fertile ground that was providing, crops and so forth. And so what we have is a ground that's become like this as a result of the drought-like conditions from climate change. And so this affects not only kind of our breadbasket, but it also affects the livelihoods of farmers. And when we talk about vulnerable communities, we do a lot of work, particularly in the South, with black farmers who tend to on average be less resourced in terms of their farming, and therefore where other farmers are able to put measures in place to guard against or to at least mitigate the impacts of climate change, some of these black farmers are actually going under because they don't really have that cushion and those measures in place to guard against those impacts. In our communities, we already have situations of food insecurity historically, whether it's through redlining or other social and economic and political inequities over time. So we have situations where people are more likely to have access to a corner store than a supermarket, and therefore when you look inside, you get a sense of what kind of foods people have access to. So the corner store foods that are high in sodium, preservatives, sugars, and so forth, and then the supermarket, not to mention a farmer's market, which is other folks have more access to, that are high in nutrients, vitamins, antioxidants, and so forth. So we see that difference, and we see the differences that come in terms of health outcomes for community members and individuals who have this differential access. In terms of sea level rise, we have countries like the Maldives where they've literally built a seawall around their communities. Around their country, to protect against the encroachment of the seas. And then right here in the United States, whether it's Kivalina Island in Alaska or Thibodaux, Louisiana, within 20 years they're going to have to move because of the encroachment of the sea on their land. And in Thibodaux, where they're losing a football field of land per hour, as it's on average as it stands, not just because of sea level rise, but also sea level rise combined with the fact that the land is actually sinking because they're in this petrochemical corridor where there's excessive oil drilling that's happening that actually results in the sinking of the land. So, and we're looking at, and there's indigenous communities being impacted, the Homa Nation in Thibodaux, and the indigenous communities of Alaska, they're in Kivalina Island. And so we're looking at not only impacts of people and communities, but also cultures that are tied to the land, tied to the water, and so forth. And then with disasters, I thought this is an important quote from the Oxfam. Disasters, however natural, are profoundly discriminatory. Pre-existing structures and social conditions determine how a community will be affected and who will pay the highest price. That's from their report, Exposed Social Vulnerability and Climate Change. So further to that point, whether it's looking at community infrastructure and what kind of preparation is in place, whether there are sandbags available, whether people even know about the sandbags, and what kind of access and distribution of that particular resource is there. Whether the other issue is the issue of mobility, whether people are able to what resources are in place, what kind of plans are in place to get people moved. We all know that low-income folks are less likely to have the types of mobility that they need to be able to escape in times of disaster. And on the right, you see how that played out for folks in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And then actually all three pictures are from Hurricane Katrina. Shows the kind of wasted resources that were there and unused. The backup for people taking single car routes to get out, and then the people who didn't have any type of mode of transportation to get out and had to be rescued. And then further to that, we have what impacts that actually had during Katrina. 1,800 individuals died because they weren't able to evacuate the city, and the people who were most vulnerable were people with special health conditions, people who were elderly or poor. And disproportionately low-income African Americans were in that situation. And as you see, that rescue situation is all folks who are African American, largely children, having to be rescued by these kind of dire measures. And then also looking at people living in floodplains. This is in Tunica, Mississippi, after the flooding of 2011. This home was underwater after the flooding had happened, and the year before, that home didn't exist. There was a whole swath of properties, and developers came in and sold to a group of African-American families. They were low-income, they were low-priced homes because they were in floodplains, but of course they didn't tell them that they were in a floodplain. And a year later, they were all underwater when the flooding came through. Let's see, and so and that's not just in situations of major floods like in 2011 in Mississippi, but in other places like Eastwick, Pennsylvania, across the country, there are folks whose homes are in floodplains who only find out that their homes are in floodplains when the floods come through, for the most part. And some places where there's regular flooding that happens, and those folks are vulnerable to that, and more so as the flooding is increasing due to climate change. If you have poor housing stock, obviously this is a home that was affected by a tornado, whereas there's a house right next door and had a more solid construction that was hardly affected at all. So you see these kind of major differences according to your housing stock. And of course, the folks who have least means tend to be the folks with the poorest housing stock. So they have these compounded challenges. And then this, I wanted to show this because this is Port Gibson, Mississippi, where there is a nuclear reactor, and when these floods came through, folks were particularly concerned because they felt that the nuclear reactor was in jeopardy of being breached, and there was only one road in and out of that town. And this is definitely a cautionary tale, because when we went to visit this community, we visited with a church that was part of the NAACP network, and they said they weren't able to get resources from the American Red Cross to establish shelters. And then we found the American Red Cross in front of City Hall, and they were just there with like a table and 2 chairs, as opposed to a full-fledged disaster recovery center that they usually have in places that were as severely affected as Grand Gulf was, or as Port Gibson was. And when we asked why it was that there was this differential resources, they said it was because it was within 7 miles of the nuclear reactor, and that they're not allowed to set up operations within 7 miles of a nuclear reactor. And that was the same reason they weren't able to provide the resources for the church. And so that's nothing against Red Cross. That's a very reasonable policy to have in place. But the issue is that that it really points to the fact that there should be similar policies in place for where people are living. For people to live that close to harm's way, where even the folks providing disaster resources know better than to be in that same position. We need to be thinking that way in terms of zoning and where our residential areas are. So given that I only have 4 minutes left, I'm going to have to really zip pretty quickly through the rest of this. But pretty much all the information on the indicators is in the document that hopefully everyone has in terms of our equity and resilience for climate adaptation planning document. So that will be your good reference point. But otherwise, I'm going to start talking like an auctioneer at this point in my remaining 4 minutes. So public housing after Hurricane Superstorm Sandy, a lot of folks were left without a means to get out of public housing, elevators out because of electricity. Some folks had low mobility issues, so they weren't able to actually take the stairs to get out. And so there were actually rescue efforts that had to be taken for folks who were in public housing. Folks in the aftermath of Katrina, deputies literally left their posts and left prisoners standing in sewage-tainted waters. They had to dig for ventilation and break windows to get air. And then when we talk about after disasters happen, there's also this issue of right to return. This community was completely demolished by the tornadoes in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. So who's going to be able to rebuild after that? Who's coming back to that town? How does that differ from town to town? Who's able to return and come back to their same way of life in Joplin versus in Tuscaloosa? How can we make sure that there's parity about who's able to return? And this is an example of one family who had saved up their whole lives, and 8 months before they had moved into this home from the city into the country, and their house was destroyed. And between what little homeowners insurance they had and what they had from FEMA, it wasn't enough for them to rebuild. So they're basically having to give up their lifelong dream that they'd saved for in terms of this home. And that's not an uncommon story. We also talk about vulnerabilities as it relates to the fact that a lot of times prison labor is used in the aftermath of disaster. So for people who are incarcerated, who's standing up for the rights of prisoners in post-disaster contexts? Similarly, there was, after the BP Oil disaster, there was hazmat situations where prisoners were used to do this cleanup, and there was differentiation in terms of who had hazmat materials in terms of covering up and who didn't. And then we talk about employment security as well. So folks who have, when this building is underwater, the employer might have insurance that covers every day that they're not operating, but what about the folks who are on the various rungs of the employment ladder? The dishwasher, the person who's cleaning, even the servers. Like, every day that they're not working, they're just not being paid. And how are we thinking about the various levels of vulnerability to impacts in this sense? This is just another example of a business owner, small business owner. And then this is also an important example. This is in the aftermath of the Hurricane Isaac in 2012. We were in Louisiana and heard an interview with Senator Mary Landrieu, who was being asked why it was that the levees in Plaquemines Parish weren't built up to the same extent that they were in New Orleans and other places. And she asked the Army Corps of Engineers that same question, and the Army Corps of Engineers said that they use a formula to decide where the levees would be built up, and the formula assigns points based on what the potential is for economic impact if a disaster should come through. So it didn't matter how many people were living there, who was living there. It only mattered the points were only assigned according to the level of economic impact. So that really goes back to our governance and decision-making question. Who developed that formula? How was it that that formula was approved? And what are the measures to really change that so that there's a social element applied in how we make those types of decisions? So my time is almost up, well, pretty much up. So I'm going to kind of rush through the rest. So basically, this is just a picture that shows who's actually giving out food, who's receiving food in the aftermath of disaster, and it was cut very evenly down racial lines. On the right side, all the folks who were receiving food were African American. On the left side, all the people who were giving food were white, which really shows a picture of like who was most impacted, who was able to bounce back, who maybe wasn't impacted at all. And it really, is an important tale in terms of what we need to be looking at in terms of building resilience for future disasters. And similarly, when we were at the town hall meeting outside that same facility, on the stage of the people who are making decisions, giving out information, who are in charge of resources, down to a person white, and the people lined up in the microphone who needed resources, needed information, down to a person African American and women as well. So interesting. So this looks much different than the original, and you probably are seeing the same thing. Okay, so it's a good thing that my time is up because these slides are not the way they originally were. But so the next slides were basically showing the various indicators that we had put forth to begin to measure these various impacts and measure the pre-existing vulnerabilities, as well as measure the assets that exist in different communities and how we can really use those indicators as we design programs. So again, all of that is in the document. So just as well that my time is up and that our slides are not quite the way they're supposed to be. So thank you very much, and I'm handing off now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jacqui. Our next presenter, I believe, is Branden.
This is Vic. I think I'm going to be the one presenting.
Okay.
Me and Branden are together, so I'm not. So I just need the PowerPoint. Okay. Should I go ahead and start?
Please do.
Okay. My name's Vic Verma, and along with Branden Johnson, we're presenting on Eco District for Longview, a project of the Signs Initiative. You can see our titles right there. Where's the forward button?
Should be in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen.
I don't see it.
Okay, I'll go ahead and... Oh, there you go. You should have
There
it
you
now.
go. I got it now. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, so in terms of safe and inviting green neighborhoods, there are three. The Signs Initiative is a joint partnership of three organizations. NAACP Longview Unit 6197. NAACP, as Jacqui has talked about, has a strong emphasis on environmental justice, and this is a core objective this is a core priority of our initiative. And I'll give credit to Branden for the name of our initiative, which is Safe and Inviting Green Neighborhoods. That was his brainchild, and that provides pretty much a great description of what we're looking to do moving forward. The second organization is Working Effectively for Clean Air Now. They're a Northeast Texas organization that, again, the name is pretty self-explanatory. They work on clean air activities and try to reduce pollution. And finally, Organizing for Action East Texas. We work on a variety of policy initiatives. One very important one that we've been working on with respect to climate change is advocacy for President Obama's new EPA regulations that are still undergoing public comment. And so we had gathered a lot of signatures and provided a lot of education for the President's new proposed regulations. So, trying to find the arrow again, sorry. There it is. Okay, so with respect to the Signs Initiative, we have established 5 overall priorities, and I think they also reflect the priorities of the 3 partners. Reducing pollution and improving standards, as you know, I think that's as the new EPA standards that are proposed indicate, that's a priority at a policy level, and it's a priority for our initiative. Environmental justice, clearly there's areas where there are worse environmental effects than others, and a lot of it is based on race and income and class. So we want to address that as well. Overall, we want to be action-oriented. We want to pursue green projects. One that's been initially discussed is a solar cooperative. I imagine that would be a pretty ambitious project. One of our local health clinics, Special Health Resources of Texas, has discussed trying to start one, and we've been in contact with them on that. Green education, that has been primarily what we've done so far, is to educate the public on ways that they can be green or sustainable in simple ways or more complex ways. But even simple ways can make a big difference. And also green partnerships. Our initiative as a whole is a green partnership, but we also look to partner with local businesses and also local universities. Paterno University is in the area where our eco-district, within our eco-district boundaries, and we look forward to working with them going forward. So here's the city of Longview and its boundaries as a whole. Longview has about 85,000 people. We are located in what's in northeast Texas, or what also is known as the Arklatex region of Texas. We are about 2 hours east of Dallas, about 60 miles west of Shreveport, Louisiana, about 40 miles from the Louisiana state line. So we're in a multi-state region. And so this is the proposed boundary of the eco-district, and one thing that we've observed in our industry, this is what we had come up with as a committee, and what this represents as it stands right now is what is South Longview. And for those who know Longview, if you look at a map, we have US Highway 80. Basically, this encompasses all areas south of Highway 80, and then surrounded by a loop that goes around the south side of Longview. It goes all the way around, but is encompassed here by the south side of the loop on the south side. And essentially, this is an area with a large African American and Hispanic population. So it's very much an area where we're looking at environmental justice issues. And so I think it's a good core area for us to start with. One of the things we've observed is that this, and Branden has noted, is that really is an area, this is much larger than a typical eco-district. So I think we've discussed looking at making the actual eco-district smaller to begin with, and work on projects there, but keep this whole area keep this entire region where you see the boundary as an area where we can draw resources from. We can also draw resources from outside the eco-district area as needed as well. We're trying to be flexible in how we set boundaries with respect to the eco-district and also the Signs Initiative objectives. So here's an outline of, we talked about our 5 priorities before, but we have 6 specific areas where we're very much looking to make an impact. Number 1 is encouraging recycling. The city of Longview has recently introduced, has expanded its recycling program in terms of curbside. The city has been behind over the years, but they're catching up very fast, and we're very grateful to the city for their assistance on this. And so we're trying to get education out there because, even with the new program, a lot of people are still throwing away their recyclables, and it's a lot easier to recycle than it probably has been in the past, and that's true in Longview. So that education is very important. On the surface, that's very simple, but it does need to be done, and it does take work and continuous work. Community and school gardens. We have community gardens in Longview, and we're trying to expand that as well, and get that as part of the Science Initiative activities. We're also trying to expand to school gardens to get kids involved in gardening, and the more they learn, the more they're interested. That gives us another tool for being more environmentally friendly. Multimodal transit in communities like Longview, what we would call public transit, has been pretty historically limited, but multimodal transit has improved a lot. We have our Longview Transit, which is our bus service, and so we want to work with Longview Transit to make sure that we have more efficient transportation vehicles that maybe work off of natural gas, and just make it easier for the users of the system to use Longview Transit. The easier it is to use, the more likely they are to use it. And the more likely they are to use it, the fewer cars that we have on the road. Home and business improvements. We look at this in many ways as an economic initiative as much as an environmental initiative. They can help, folks can help the environment while improving their bottom line through energy savings. Green energy options, looking at areas like solar. Solar would be the prime option that we would have as a green energy option here in East Texas. And then finally, water. Water is fairly plentiful in East Texas, but there's also, we do need to be mindful of the environmental quality as it pertains to water. Basically, we would like to maintain clean water. Also, while we don't have drought issues in East Texas, there are in West Texas, and water is always a topic of a discussion from that standpoint. We can never be too careful. So we've had 3 events to date. What we started out with last July was showing the first episode of the HBO series, Years of Living Dangerously, or actually I believe that's a Showtime series. So that raised awareness. We also had an event on energy savings and awareness, and that we have brought the City of Longview to talk about the recycling program. We brought AEP SWEPCO, which is the utility provider, to talk about the energy saving rebate programs. And we also brought a solar consultant to talk about how solar can help you save money and help the environment. And finally, we followed that up with another event, recycling and sustainability, where we brought the city back actually to talk about recycling, because we can't emphasize enough its importance, and education is key. We also brought a speaker, Rob Holloway, who's the owner of New Orleans Gardens, which is a local nursery, to talk about smart landscaping, conservation, and sustainability. So, and one event that, before I conclude, we're looking on March 30th to have what we call Signs World Cafe event. And what we're trying to do is, what we've done so far is we've put together a lot of events. But what we're really needing is community feedback and input and participation. So what we're going to do is, at this event on March 30th, we are going to pose questions to attendees that they will answer in a group and come up with pretty thorough answers. And then we'll compile all of that information, and from there we will have a much better idea of where we're going forward as an initiative. And I think it will give us a great roadmap for future activities. So that's March 30th here in Longview. That's going to be our next big event. Just some resources that you can see on the screen: ecodistricts.org, NAACP.org on climate justice, and BarackObama.com/climate. These are all websites for the various partner groups. And then on Facebook, we all have pages: NAACP Longview, Organizing for Action East Texas, and we can. If you put those words in, you can join up and learn more about our activities. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Vic. Okay, Kathy, you are up next.
Okay, I'm here. Okay, first let me go back that a little fast. give you a little background about the demographics of Gulfport, Mississippi. Here's the demographic by age, and here's our demographic by race. And all of these are post-Katrina figures. Here's the demographic by income. Okay. And just wanted to briefly touch on the fact, and I didn't have the trajectory of the BP oil spill. However, in planning for our environmental impact and climate change impact, we are also was one of the front lines of the man-made disaster of the BP oil spill. And some of the efforts that we used after Katrina were things that could be applied to any man-made disasters as well, such as the BP oil spill. And we are taking advantage of some opportunities from the as far as financing from the BP oil spill from the Gulf Recovery Fund in order to try and boost our eco-district planning. This is the Gulfport Harrison County disaster data, where, as you see, we have natural disasters in Harrison County, 21, which is almost double the U.S. average disasters of 12. And we have had 17 presidential declared major disasters. And here's a breakdown of the other disasters that we have had in recent years. Let me go back again. This is the path of Hurricane Katrina. As you can see, the impact was right in Mississippi. Actually, it came ashore a quarter mile from my house. I live a quarter mile from the Gulf of Mexico. And the fatalities of Hurricane Katrina, as you see, it was a total of over 1,800, 238 of those were in Mississippi. The majority of the fatalities in Louisiana was a result of the levee system breaking. And the historical population of Gulfport, as you can see, we experienced a tremendous growth that was only due to annexation efforts in 2000, and we have a 74% increase in population. However, since Katrina, our census data show that we had a decrease in population by 4.7%. And so, because of this frontline community, not only with natural disasters, but we also, and I'll cover this a little bit more in the presentation, Gulfport is also the home site of a failing coal plant. However, the good news on that is due to the advocacy of several organizations, we were able to have the coal burning operation to cease as of next month. So that is one thing that we're really excited about and really proud about, and looking forward to renewable sources of energy. We've been advocating for that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But first, the stakeholders in this, I think I heard Jackie mention in the presentation about who's at the decision-making table, and that's one of the things that we are really keen on in Gulfport, is assuring that there is equity in decision-making at the decision-making table. I was attending a meeting regarding a historic community, African-American populated community called Turkey Creek, and we had this down at City Hall, and then somebody asked, well, who are the people in the community? So we, immediately said, we've got to reschedule this meeting and take it to the community. It was great to have city officials there, but we need the key stakeholders, and that would be the people in that community. And in our eco-district planning, we wanted to make sure that all of our stakeholders, the residents, the faith community, all of our partner organizations, elected officials, service agencies, and even our government oversight regulatory agencies, such as MDEQ, we wanted to make sure that everybody was at the decision-making table. Under the resilience, when we first went to our mayor and city planner about resilience, getting a resilience program started in the city of Gulfport, we were told, oh, we've already done that. We did that after Katrina. And so we went, oh, wow, we didn't know anything about it. We were not at the table when that went on. And so as they started showing us what they did, it was all infrastructure resilience as it related to the rebuilding efforts. And so I'll show you some pictures of that. But we also wanted to focus on coping skills, both personal and professional, as it relates to our first responders, our educators. So we're looking at having some type of resilience program that we will avail to our entire community, so that people, because we are so prone to disasters in this area, and you still have people who have PTSD syndromes from these disasters, not only the environmental disasters and climate disasters, but the man-made disasters, BP oil spill as well. And we also are interested in having special emphasis on our vulnerable and at-risk residents, especially our seniors, disadvantaged women and children, to make sure that everyone's needs are met. Under the, also I'll back up a little bit. We also have proposed and have been discussing the possibility of our city council passing a clean air resolution. Not on our city council, but we have a county board of supervisors, so that we can have our local government to participate and recognize the need for cleaner air in our community. For the senior disadvantaged women and children, we have talked with our mayor about the possibility of modeling a weather, severe weather alert program, model it on the Amber Alert, and so that people can receive phone calls, text messages for mandatory as well as volunteer evacuation. And also, we are looking at establishing weather watch models after the neighborhood watch program, whereby senior citizens would have people to check on them and make sure that all of their needs are being met during climate and weather disasters. And one of the preparations, one of the major preparations that we've already been able to have established is a no-cost evacuation effort, whereby there will be accessible mass transportation to distant safety shelters. We've already actually kind of had a dry run in this area, whereby we have had buses to transport our residents to safety in Jackson, Mississippi. Fortunately, the weather alert was not as severe as predicted, but at least we knew that better, saved lives, and it really would have made a difference if we had something like that during Hurricane Katrina. We are also looking at, and our city has been great about doing the routine drainage maintenance and assisting with our drainage to assist with our flood. We've had several buyouts of flood-prone homes, and we had one in particular that was in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. We have tree trimming away from the power lines to assist during storms or disasters. And also we have a great opportunity in the, I mentioned that we had the coal plant, which is also located near my house. I'm kind of right in between the coal plant and the Gulf, the beach. We had where the Southern Company, when they agreed to cease its coal burning function at Plant Jack Watson, they also agreed that they would end their opposition to net metering. So we do have an opportunity to actively support net metering, and we expect that to appear on the docket of our Public Service Commission this year. And we really want to focus, however, on energy democracy and equity as it relates to net metering, because there are very fears that are understandable that it would be a cost shift, and we don't want this to be a cost shift to where, again, low income and minorities would be paying for a subsidy for people who can afford solar. We want solar to be available to everyone, so we're really promoting programs that are already in place for low-income solar ownership. We also have established a community garden. We have spoken with our school superintendent and our faith community about establishing school and church gardens. The city has been very gracious in committing to irrigation for the community garden, and it's also offered us several acres of land to use for to expand our community garden project. And we're looking at churches. We've already had churches to agree that they would assist in the maintenance of the garden. The same is true with our school system. We have spoken with our school superintendent and about the having a school garden. And as you'll see here, this is, and I could not find a photo of our old police department, but this police municipal complex was built with the infrastructure resilience program, and it was built to sustain a certain amount of hurricane force winds. Let me go to the next photo. As you can see here, this is our pre-Katrina City Hall on your left and our post-Katrina City Hall on the right. Again, it was built to withstand some of our hurricane force winds that we are subject to. On the left, you'll see we have our campaign for energy transition. That is a photo of Plant Watson, which is slated to cease its coal burning operations next month. And so we're slated to look into adopting a net metering policy in Mississippi that would encourage the use of solar. On the left here is our current Gulfport High School. We just voted last November on a bond initiative to build a new high school. So we have all kind of opportunities there, and have been talking with the school superintendent about not only energy efficiency, but we're hoping that we could avail the use of solar in our new high school that we will have built. And that's something that we're really encouraged and excited about. Did I go back too far?
Nope, you're fine. Thank you very much,
Okay.
Kathy.
Okay. All right. Okay.
We inadvertently skipped over one of our speakers, Branden. I thought he was folding into Vic's presentation. We only have a couple minutes, and we don't have very many questions. So, Branden, if you have another point that you'd like to make, please do. Okay, while Branden finds his voice, I think he might be muted. I'll ask one of the questions that was submitted. David Elvin submits, because disaster and resiliency funds are often from the federal government, should or do federal civil rights laws like Title 11 apply to the way resiliency funds may be spent? Any of the panelists have thoughts on that?
I would think that would.
Go ahead, Kathy.
I was going to say, I would think they would be subjected to the same regulations as any other funds, federal funds.
Okay. Anybody else? I apologize. It's Title 6. Okay. Another question. Jacqui, are you still with us?
I am.
Excellent. There's a specific question to you from Linda Rudolph. She thanks you for the great presentation, and she's wondering if you're planning to or have any recommendations for data sources for each of the indicators on your FIND indicator list. And the link to those indicators, for those of you who want to refer to something, is on the website, the webinar website.
Yes. Well, let's see. There are data sources for various indicators. The ones that we came up with were based on our experiences, so we didn't get them from any place else. But there's definitely different social. Like Susan Hunter has some great social indicators around disasters. But the reason we put the tool together is because no one else that we had been able to find had direct indicators, these types of indicators for this type of context and framework. But as I said, Susan Hunter has some for disasters, as well as there's the STAR initiative. I don't know what STAR stands for, but there's a STAR index, which has some great indicators as well for like community development and so forth. And I can, Linda can feel free to reach out individually if and I can share what all I've found and kind of doing my research, which determined that there was nothing else that was like what we put out. So, yes.
Excellent, thanks.
Sure.
A question for the folks from Longview, Texas. Andrew Klein would like to know if there are federal funds being used as resources for the eco-district effort there. Vic or Branden, I think you may both be muted on your end.
Okay, this is Vic. Yeah, that's not something we have pursued yet, but I think it's definitely something we want to pursue, and I think we're looking at options accordingly on that and seeing how we go about doing that. And we would welcome any feedback from anyone on what the best way of going about that is.
Opportunity to share. Please feel free to use the chat to exchange information if anybody has any. I am going to wrap up this webinar. We're at an hour. I want to thank everyone for participating. I especially want to thank our 4 panelists. And you can find a recording of the webinar next week, as I said, if you want to listen to it again or share it with others. The next National Adaptation Forum webinar will be live from the National Adaptation Forum, and it'll be held May 14th from the St. Louis venue. If some of you are there, you may become members of that panel. And if you haven't registered for the National Adaptation Forum, a friendly reminder that early bird registration ends on February 28th. thank you all for listening. Please share this podcast with others once it is posted. And again, thank you to our wonderful panel.